Hi everyone, this is Darren from SimNation. Just wanted to do a quick video to talk about SimNation's uh, league for Draft Day Sports College Football 2023, which is of course the SNCFL. We are now in the playoffs, and I thought I would just kind of do a state of the league. I haven't done one of these in a while, and I keep telling myself I'm going to try to get back into this. So for those of you not aware, SNCFL is a Draft Day Sports College Football 2023 title, or league, sorry. And it has quite a few really good human coaches in it. The league's been around for multiple years, multiple versions, and I will say that it's definitely one of the more competitive leagues out there. It's pretty rich in history. There's some people from our past that, if they're listening to this, I would always enjoy for them to come back. People like Doc, Lowell, and some of the other crew that have departed over the years, Matt, P, and stuff like that. But with the coaches we have right now, we got some recent additions, and it's made the league even more competitive. So if you notice on the screen, I have Maryland up in front of us. I don't really want to talk about them just yet, but uh, this league is just an amazing league, and I strongly encourage you, if you like Draft Day Sports College Football 2023, join this league. You're going to find a lot of good coaches. We have a Slack channel, and week in and week out, the games are very competitive. And of course, this league feeds the WWPF, which is SimNation's staple Draft Day Sports Pro Football 2023 league. I, of course, do commission this. I also have multiple teams in this league, so I'm a little biased, if you will. So I'll end the shameless plugging right now. So, as I mentioned, we are now in the playoffs. It's been a really interesting year with this league, and I'm going to kind of start with the standings. Um, One of the things is this was a more wide open season than I've seen in a while, and I definitely will tell you I kind of enjoy it. For those of you not aware, um, the previous seasons we had, um, the previous season, Miami won it. Miami is run by Gary, who used to be the commissioner for the WWPF, as well as he used to have the Philadelphia Eagles. Of course, Miami beat Maryland last year. It was a really good game. Gary has got his team dialed again this year. They made the playoffs, and I'll talk about the first round in a second. But Miami's just been dominant all season. Gary will tell you he hasn't played anyone. I don't agree with that. I think that he's played quite a few really good coaches. The Coastal definitely is dominated by Miami at this point. Most of the human coaches, though, are in the Atlantic. So both Florida State and North Carolina State are human coach teams. Florida State is, of course, coached by Sample, sorry. And NC State is coached by Van. Downhill for both teams, but I mean, if you call 9-5 and 10-3 a downhill, I guess you could, because both of them typically are in the playoffs or approaching it. I do want to talk about Florida State real quick. While they had a downhill this year, they did sign the number one recruit. As you can see, is Asa Garcia, who is someone that I thought would go to Maryland or go to Alabama, chose Florida State, and that he's a game changer. So Florida State has a really good class this year coming in, so I expect them to bounce right back. Of course, you can see that Gary snagged a really good running back, pretty high on him as well. But I think also NC State has had a really good recruiting season as well. So I think what you're going to see is ACC is going to be uber competitive next year. Um, the American Athletic, both top teams in the American Athletic are actually human coach teams. So Central Florida is, of course, coached by Cable. He's had a really disastrous year on WWPF with the New York Giants. I know he's looking forward to the fact that he's going to get the number one pick, and he may very well choose his own quarterback from UCF, which is his team. McCulloch, we'll talk a little bit more about him in a few minutes, is just an absolute stud. He doesn't have a great arm, but he's highly accurate. And my hope is that he doesn't get nerfed by the randomizer and that he shows up as the stud that he is in WWPF. Houston is actually coached by Travis, who's on a break right now. But one of the marks of a really good coach who sets up a system is the ability to walk away from it, and that team still excels. And my hope is Travis will be back with us full time next season. But his team is dialed in, and we'll talk a little bit about the AAC and the playoffs. They put two teams into the playoffs. Both teams are still in the playoffs after the first round, so that's pretty amazing. Um, the Big 12, we got some additions in the human space within the Big 12. So Oklahoma State, of course, is coached by Frankie, and Frankie used to be the other commissioner of WWPF. I'm glad to have him back. He did a really good job with Oklahoma State over the course of the season. They did have a little bit of a setback in the playoffs, but my I really think Frankie will have them dialed in. Um, Iowa State, of course, is the Cinderella story of the season. They're coached by Shark. Shark does his own content as well, and he has videos up on YouTube around Iowa State. But Iowa State was one of the worst teams in the league, and he's really turned them around. He got them into the playoffs. Unfortunately for him, his number one first round opponent was Maryland. That probably didn't go the way he wanted it to, but he's done a phenomenal job with them, and I think he deserves the kudos there. Baylor is coached by Houston, if I remember correctly, and they've done really good this year considering that he hasn't had the time to be able to really put a lot of focus on them. I do expect that to change next year. Driscoll is their quarterback. He's a really good quarterback. So I really think that you'll see them take a very big step forward next season as he gets more time to focus in on them. Um, from a recruiting perspective, not a lot of great 5 stars going, but they have a lot of quality 4 stars. Baylor, of course, has done well. Oklahoma continues to do well, even though the season wasn't all that good. And that's the team I used to coach, so I have a little bit of a sympathy for them. The Big Ten has had an interesting season this year. No change at the top. Maryland still is the team to beat in the Big Ten. But Ohio State had a really good season. The only loss, of course, was to Maryland. Michigan was a little bit down this year, and I know that's got Stu down a little bit, but they came on strong near the end. Iowa, of course, is coached by Frankie. That's his other team. And then Minnesota was a pretty rough season for JC in his first season. I think he'll get that turned around. And Don had a pretty rough season at Penn State. But again, I think he'll get that turned around. Um, Maryland, of course, dominates the recruiting award when it comes into the Big Ten. And they've got a couple really big people coming in. Alan DeLeon is probably the one that they're most excited about as a running back, especially since they lose Batiste, who's their main starting running back this year, and they could lose Marcus Witten, who's their quarterback. But uh, both Big Ten teams that made it to the playoffs are still in it. Maryland down to Iowa State, and of course, Ohio State crushed Oklahoma State, as you can see downhill. So it'll be an interesting second round matchup as DP, who's has Ohio State, but he hasn't really uploaded this year. Most of this year takes on Gary. So that's a little bit of a rivalry from WWPF. And then, of course, you have Cable, who's going to be playing Maryland. And that one's a good matchup because you have potentially the top 2 quarterbacks going into the draft who are going to face off against each other. Marcus Witten from Maryland, and then of course we already talked about McCulloch from Central Florida. Witten's a junior, so he may not come out, but if he does, I expect him to be one of the top 2 quarterbacks. But again, it's not for sure because of the randomizer. I do want to say something about Udo. Udo took UTEP over, and I know he's dropping them at the end of the season, but he really turned them around, got them into the playoffs, and of course, they didn't probably have the success that they were hoping to have in the playoffs, but it's still a great season from them. Nothing to be ashamed of. As you can see, Calvin had a really good season as a quarterback, and then of course McClary benefited from it. Memphis is, I believe, also run by Pops. So maybe not as good of a season this season. I'm thinking that I'm in the wrong conference, so I'll deal with that later. But James Madison is, of course, run by Soa. They had a pretty up and down year, but again, I think he's going to get them on the right track for next season. Um, Independence, not really going to talk about them. BYU will move into the Big 12, I believe, and BYU is coached by JC. They only played 10 games this year because of quirk in the game, but I do look forward to see what he does next year. As you can see, he's had a pretty decent recruiting season. Uh, the MAC begins and ends with Western Michigan. It's one of the three teams Stu has. They had a great season. All the losses were to quality teams. Of course, the last loss was in the playoffs against, it was a matchup of Stu versus Stu, as they had to take on UCLA. And Western Michigan had the misfortune of running into Washington State in the season, which was one of the other losses. But he continues to position them extremely well. They have a great running back in Bellinger. And then, as you can see, is they've got some quality coming in. Um, Akron is another team to keep an eye on. They are, if I remember correctly, I think that they were managed for a long time by a human coach, but it's a team just to keep an eye on. The Mountain West, we don't really, well, we do. If I remember correctly, I think Don has Air Force. But a quick plug for New Mexico. I quietly had them last season, and it's good to see that despite the fact that they really sucked under me, that they had a really good year this year, largely behind Brian Cooper and Frederick Dowling, who were two people that I really plugged into that system. So um, the Pac-12 was a little different this year. Um, Maybe not different in who made it to the Pac-12 championship. It again was a Wazoo versus UCLA, where UCLA took the regular season matchup, and Washington State took the Pac-12 championship. Um, but we welcomed Skelton into the conference at Stanford. Pops had a 4 year at USC. I believe Gary's still at Arizona State or Arizona. I can't remember which one, but um, just a very wide open season for the most part. They did get three teams into the playoffs: Washington State, UCLA, and USC. Washington State, of course, lost to Georgia in the first round, but both USC and UCLA both won their matchups, and of course, the uh, the reward for that is they get to face each other. This conference was dominated by rushing attacks. You didn't really see a lot of great wide open passing. The story of the year in the conference is Ricky Merriman, who is a two-star running back who was plugged in at Washington State and just exploded. And I'm going to have a recruiting video up about how to find those gem three-star, two-star, one-star players. Because I think that if you're trying to rebuild your team, that's going to be important. But I can't forget Richard Harper. He may, depending on how far UCLA goes into the playoffs, he may actually outdo Merriman in yards, even though Merriman played in less games. Um, Big story here is probably Charles Straub. I think he's a game changer based on what I've seen. I tried to recruit him at Maryland. I was going to recruit him at Washington State, and then I backed off him. But another really great get for Washington is Ken Hedrickson. He's also, I think, going to be a really, really good um, player for them. And of course, they're bringing in probably one of the highest ranked quarterbacks ever in Kim Hawthorne, who's also a 5 star. You won't see Washington State in a lot of this, mostly just because they don't go after 5 stars. They're a 4-star and 3-star factory. But the other person to call out is Pops. Pops has really guided USC to a strong season. They did finish second in the South, but they did make the playoffs. They won their first round game, which is no small thing. And of course, as you can see from a recruiting perspective, they've just had a phenomenal year. So hats off to Pops. I know him from way back when in the BBCF or ball bound college football leagues that we have, but he's a strong coach. Um, we welcome some new people into the Southeastern as well, or SEC. So Auburn and Alabama are both new. Nick, I know he's been off and on, did a good job of getting Auburn on track. They've made the playoffs, and even though they had a first round setback, they're still had a great season. Skelter had ULM dialed in, but of course they had a loss or two that kicked them out of the chance of getting into the playoffs. I'm sorry, getting into the title game for the SEC because it went to Auburn instead. And then you had Alabama, who kind of underperformed, but Devonta, I think, hasn't been around as much. And then LSU, of course, is one of my teams. Well, they started strong and then kind of faded and then picked it back up. Georgia is a Shark team. Great story there again. He's had a very strong year. Nothing to be ashamed of at all. Florida, maybe a little bit underperformed with SOA this year, but still a pretty strong season. And then, of course, I know Udo is leaving UTEP for Tennessee to focus on Tennessee. He already had Tennessee because Tennessee had a pretty down year. But Udo's a great coach. I expect to see Tennessee bounce right back. Um, ULM dominates recruiting in the SEC. Skelter, despite all of his complaints about the anti-Skelter code, has just really knocked it out with recruiting, as you can see. I mean, I won't be shocked if he's one of the top classes. I do like the quarterback that the University of Florida got. I really like the free safety that Bama got. Um, I was after him for a long time, and I think, again, he's going to be a game changer. So I say that a lot, but in those cases, I actually definitely think that he will. And then finally, we don't really have any human teams in the Sun Belt anymore, but Louisiana Lafayette still is benefiting from the longtime presence of a human there. Uh, and they had a great season, even though it came to an end pretty early in the playoffs, much earlier than anyone thought. So if we look at the playoffs real quick, so in the first round, go here. So you had Iowa State and Maryland. It was a mismatch. Iowa State had a great season, but Maryland is just maybe too much for them. I do think that they did much better than maybe some people thought, but trying to cover all the wide receivers at Maryland plus Batiste and the other running backs that they have, it was a really good game, and Maryland managed to put it on in the second half and pull away. Central Florida, again, McCullough is having a great season. Cable's having a great season. It's a shame that their second round opponent's Maryland. I do think that Central Florida can beat Maryland. I'm just going to put that out there right now. McCullough, if he has a great game, if Witten doesn't have as good of a game, and just so everyone understands, I have a love-hate relationship with Witten. While he is a stud, he was a former #1 recruit. He throws a lot of interceptions, and it drives me nuts sometimes. So, but I wouldn't be shocked if you see Maryland put the ball more on the ground with Batiste, who really should be a top draft pick in the WWPF because he is a senior. But we'll see how that one goes. I think that one's going to be a shootout. The Battle of the Stews went to the Stew on the West Coast instead of the Stew from the Midwest. Um, and as a result, he gets to yet again play another team that he's played. This seems to be the ever fun evolution for Stu. Is He's already played USC once. I believe they won that game. I don't remember, but if he wins this game, he gets to play Maryland. And of course, if Pops wins, he gets to play Maryland, and they both have played Maryland before. Uh, USC over Louisiana Monroe was an upset. Um, didn't expect that one. There's a slight talent differential between the two, but kudos to Pops. That's a great win for him in his USC program. If he gets past Stu, and it's possible, um, although I think UCLA is probably going to be heavily favored in that one. But if he does, then he's got a strong chance of beating Maryland and making it to the championship game. On the flip side, Miami versus UTEP just wasn't a fair matchup. Udo's done a great job with UTEP, but like I said, Gary has Miami dialed in. DP in Ohio State is a strong team. Um, I think Maryland barely beat them. So it doesn't shock me that they clobbered Oklahoma State. Uh, if they play again next year, I don't expect to see that same type of result because Frankie will have another year in the system, and I think he'll be able to change some of that. But um, Ohio State Miami's going to be a phenomenal game. It's two heavyweights facing off. Um, we'll see how that goes. Auburn losing to Houston isn't too much of a shock to me. Travis is a really good coach, even though he hasn't been around. He really set that team up for success. Uh, I did expect potentially that Nick could win that game, but again, I think Nick hasn't been around in the last few weeks either. So it was a battle of two really good coaches who set their teams up for success, but weren't there for it. Georgia versus Washington State. This one hurts a little bit. Um, the four fumbles didn't help Washington State, and while I think that Washington State could have won that game, the better team I think did win in Georgia. I think Georgia's the better team than Wazoo. Wazoo's very one-dimensional in its rushing attack. So hats off to Shark for that win. And his reward is he gets to play Houston, who is no easy target. But I think I can honestly see Shark making it into the semifinals, where he'll get the joy of either playing DP or Gary. So really good playoff setup for this year. Talk a little bit about the league leaders. Um, Quarterback wise, McCulloch, can't say enough about him. He has passed for over 20,000 yards in his career. Of course, 5,200 this year. Driscoll is a really good quarterback as well. I think he's a sophomore, if I remember correctly, so he won't be coming out. And then the others had a good season, but Calvin, just the turnaround Udo did with Calvin is pretty substantial. Witten's kind of underperforming, which is the story of his life at Maryland. Um, Touchdown wise, again, JC did a great job. I think he started like an air raid type offense, and it shows they've been passing for touchdowns. It'll be fun to watch what he does next season. Rushing yards, I mentioned this earlier. Merriman has just had a phenomenal season. He's a speed running back, which they do really well at Wazoo. Harper is kind of the alternative, and that's really emerged as a rivalry between UCLA and Washington State. They both tend to put running backs into the WWPF. I would say the UCLA running backs, I think, do a better job than the Wazoo ones. Um, a lot of eyes will be on Batiste coming out. He is just a phenomenal running back with great stats. And if he doesn't get nerfed, I think by the randomizer, I think he's going to show up really well in the draft. Outside of that, if you notice, there's a trend here. Most of in fact, all but one of the top 10 are from human control teams. Receivers, Motley had a great season, but again, Desamon and Shoemaker from Baylor, that air raid offense has definitely paid dividends. And then, of course, McCleary benefited from having Udo as his coach. So it'll be interesting to see. There's some really good wide receivers that could potentially come out this season. Um, and it'll be interesting to see. I don't, if I remember correctly, I think Desmond's an underclassman, and I think Schumacher is as well. I'm not going to click though. Um, I don't really put a lot into tackles, but I will say that there were a couple players who stood out this year. I like Hodgson as a safety. I think he had a pretty good year. Frankie has something to do with that. Um, Sack wise, Chisholm had a great season. He came on really near the end. I do think Bogan uh, had the potential to be the sack leader, but he really had one big game where he had like 6 or 7 sacks. But since then, he's been a little bit more quiet. Hart is someone to keep an eye on as well because Frankie did a great job with him. Interceptions. This is not a category we normally have a lot of human teams in, but you can tell the work Shark's done with Georgia because Humes is up there. Frankie has always been known as a great defensive coach. So Jorge Lewis has done good. Baggett is someone I've always liked at Maryland. He's just now getting a chance to really play because he's been stuck behind a whole bunch of other people. But that's kind of the state of the league. I don't think I can see the recruiting standings. Maybe I can. Um, Sorry, I clicked through a couple of things. It's under league media. So, but yeah, we can't see it yet. But generally speaking, it's been a great season, and I think that we're setting ourselves up for really, really interesting final few weeks within the playoffs. The storyline, of course, is can Gary repeat as a national champion? Will we see a new one crowned in either UCLA with Stu? Or will we see DP get a national championship at Ohio State? Can Cable uh, ease the painful memory of what's happened with the Giants in WWPF by winning it all in SNCFL? Can Georgia get Shark his first one, or will this be Pop's first season with it? Or will Maryland return to its dominance and potentially win a championship, which they haven't under Witten, which is a measuring stick I have. But ever since he's been quarterback, they really haven't delivered. So, but again, great league. If you're interested, I'll put the links in the video. I will get around to doing one of these for WWPF. WWPF is in its playoffs as well, where it's been a little bit more wide open season than normal. And some of the teams at the top are a little bit more shocking. I mean, the Cowboys made the playoffs, which is something that doesn't happen all the time. But if you'd like this video, of course, hit like. I'll do more of these. I'll shorten them quite a bit. But the next focus for me is to get the recruiting video out and kind of talk about that. I will talk about playbooks a little bit more in the off season because I think I've learned some things over the course of this season, and of course, I've learned them just in time for sometime after the next season, potentially for 2024 to come out, which may change some things. So if you like it, let me know. Otherwise, thank you for your time, and this was just a quick review. Thanks.